Chief Bowles and his band of Cherokee were guilty of acts of ethnic cleansing and enslaved hundreds of Osage on their way to Texas at the Battle of Strawberry Moon. Jose Antonio Navarro was a slaveholder and a member of the elite class. His impact as a statesman through decades of Texas history is eclipsed by his ownership of human beings. Buffalo soldiers killed indigenous people and willingly advanced the brutal doctrine known as manifest destiny. Cherokee leader Richard Fields is the father of chattel slavery in Texas. Before Austin's old 300 colonizers, Fields was in East Texas with slaves. Lorenzo de Zavala was virulently anti-Mexican and wrote awful things about his countrymen. He called them superstitious, ignorant, lazy, belligerent, vain, intolerant, and so much more. He helped to found 2 republics, each economically dependent on unfree labor. So y'all are probably calling on all these statements, and you'd be right to do that, but I think there's a chance that's where we're headed. Where else can the radicals go after they've problematized and decentered everyone from the so-called dominant culture? Historiography, the study of how history is studied, is a fascinating field. There are trends in how history is studied, and those trends dictate what historians write and even what passes for solid source material. There have been numerous schools of thought since ancient times, but we're going to focus on the big ones closest to us. Number 1, the Great God Theory credited God as the guiding hand of all human events, so history and biography were written accordingly. The Great Man Theory had a pretty long run. This theory holds that leaders are born, not shaped, by society or outside forces. Then when the time is right, their inborn talents are activated to allow these men to shape the society around them and alter the course of history. In other words, the works of great man historians focus on the big players and the influence of their courage, intellect, ability, and so on. Then in the 1960s and 70s, we saw a revolution in the academy that ushered in new social history, a history that focused on how large populations, not great individuals, shaped history. This gave us all the studies in the academic constellation: women's studies, gender studies, all the ethnic studies. It stood in opposition to the drum and trumpet history born out of great man theory. The new social history movement has kind of given way to cultural history, which gives us the class, identity, and race studies that we talk about so much today. The most radical approach to social and cultural history that throws critical theory into the mix is what predominates in the university now. History focused on marginalized people and their resistance to oppression. Sound familiar? All of history is slaves and masters. The great men become oppressors, and the oppressed valiantly struggle against it. We associate the words people's history with Howard Zinn, but he didn't invent that genre. He brought it to the public, but Zinn's book was a reflection of what was going on in the academy among professional historians. And that's where we've stayed pretty much since at least the 1970s. There's nothing wrong with adding more voices to the narrative. It's great, it's enriching, it's awesome. Nothing wrong with studying group behaviors and cultural movements to better understand the past, but people's history strays from the accepted norms traditionally found in the profession. Rather than striving for objectivity, it is, by design, value-laden. Instead of avoiding presentism, the school of thought is steeped in present-day politics and is quite future-looking. It is advocacy history. In other words, it's an activist movement whose main focus is to take a critical eye to the major figures of the so-called dominant culture: Columbus, Washington, Austin, and the cultures that they came from. And then it applies those criticisms to the dominant culture today in a highly politicized way. So, since it seeks to be the antithesis of great man theory, I call this activist history the vile villain view of history. It's how Stephen F. Austin stops being the father of Texas and becomes the father of Texas slavery and must be diminished. That's why Sam Houston is only heroic in the context of his opposition to secession and must be diminished. It's why the Alamo is often referenced as a symbol of white supremacy, and historians encourage us to forget it, or at very least to remember it as a symbol of white supremacy. Now, you would think historians would understand the past, at least the recent past, right? And understand historiographical stagnation. You'd think they'd know that theories of history, like every other cultural phenomenon, inspire reactions and provoke change, just like the movement to which they belong was a reaction to an old way of doing things. But they don't understand that. And they don't understand that they aren't the radicals because it's not 1960 anymore. And yet they all think they're Angela Davis. Their movement's been passed on from advisor to grad student for several generations now. They're in the mainstream, even in Texas. They ain't the rebels, y'all. They're the squares. That's why they continue to tell us marginalized voices are still marginalized despite 4 decades of historians writing mostly about marginalized groups. These historians can't be on the cutting edge if the marginalized have been pulled to the center by their movement. History tells us that when the profession becomes this saturated with one school of thought, change is inevitable. Now, the way I see it, the pushback could go one of 2 ways. Best case scenario, traditional historians, those who don't engage in activism, will, in the coming decades, repopulate universities. Each individual and group will be written about according to the historical record, rather than according to the modern political landscape. Their wins, their losses, their virtues, their sins will be included in the context of the times they lived in. You know, history. Or, worse, devastating, actually, for history and culture, the vile villain mentality will be taken to its logical end. Younger historians with no targets left to problematize will take the critical activist eye to all prominent figures, without race and gender exceptions. Richard Fields, the Cherokee leader, will be written off as a mere slave owner. Lorenzo de Zavala's frank commentary on Mexican culture, that'll be problematic. Buffalo Soldier memorials, bye-bye. None of these men receive much scorn or scrutiny today because they belonged to once marginalized groups. In other words, in this worst case scenario, eventually everyone will be a vile villain except for the enlightened, self-congratulatory historians and those who read and cite their books. We're kind of sitting at a crossroads in Texas history, and I wonder, which way do y'all think we're going to go? Does the pendulum swing back toward traditional objective history without activism? Or does it continue to swing like a wrecking ball at every historical figure, reducing them down to misdeeds that serve modern political trends and defend modern sensibilities? Do you think we return to history with full context, or do we sink deeper into retributive history that promises a better tomorrow but actually helps no one? Ruminate on it and let me know down in the comments what you think will happen and why. Or, more interesting, what you think will happen and how. Until next time, God in Texas, y'all.